I'm used to it. This presentation is part of a project, a larger project that I'm working on since, I think, maybe since I finished my PhD, on and off. It's about, well, I think the title says it all. It's about the institutional bonds of philosophy. And in a sense, I'd say it has points of contact with the group, but since I've only started attending the meetings late last year and this year, it's mostly been through conversations with some of the people in the group, especially Gabriel, Miriam, Caron also. And the last, I wasn't sure if it was something I should or could present here because, well, I think we all have our insecurities. But after the meeting with Extimate, I think that's what the group was called, I thought it was worth trying to present it, especially since in the coming months, I'll be trying to work this out into a book. I don't know how long it will take. I hope to finish it in this year at least. And this would be the second part of the book in some sense, because it's a book comprised of 4 chapters. And it's basically an answer, or me trying to answer, what is philosophy, but with, I would say, materialist or institutional methodology. I'm not really sure what I'm doing here exactly, like in the way, but it's an attempt to figure out what is the meaning of philosophy in the landscape we have today, especially concerning the crisis in the university, because I think this is a worldwide crisis, and I think the Extimate group pointed that out quite clearly. And I don't think we have a clear-cut way out. I think we are pretty much, we have to invent our way out of it in some form. And I think philosophy, I wouldn't say it has a special place in this problem, but I do think that the fact that philosophy is a discipline or a practice that is much older than the university, the academic institution, I think it points some paths that we can take to think things out differently. So basically, just so you can get the big picture, I plan to start the book with a chapter on Kant and Hegel, on the end of philosophy, because I think it's like, who doesn't want to be the one to say this is how philosophy ends? I think it's like there's a great pleasure in doing that kind of analysis, and this is basically based mostly on a Brazilian philosopher called Paulo Arantes and a French Kantian and Hegel scholar called Gerard Lebrun, who said that philosophy, in a sense, starts to end with Kant, because Kant displaces the question of philosophy from the question of theory or of content to the problem of form. So when Kant asks not what we are thinking, but how we are thinking, in a sense, he is leaving philosophy without a subject in the sense that there's no, we are not like English or Irish or Scottish essays talking about moral and tastes and whatever. We are always talking about the formal systems that allow thinking to be thought, and so on and so on. So I think that this starts with Kant, but it's a process that, as Paulo Arantes points out, it ends in a sense with Marx, because with Marx, I think not only the subject is displaced as a theme, but the subject as the thinking subject is also displaced, because he tries, it's a Marxist point of view where the place of thought in the world goes from philosophy to economics. and the thinking subject, in a sense, is the proletariat, even though that can be discussed later on. But that would be the first chapter. The second chapter would be pretty much what I'm presenting you all here, which is an analysis of what are the institutions of philosophy, and I'll be focusing on two models. One is the Platonic model, which I think is, well, I love Plato, so that's one thing. The other thing is because I think the way, the first time that philosophy was institutionalized in the West was definitely through Plato's Academy as a reception and systematization of Socrates' thought. And also be trying to work out what this institutionality is when we talk about the academic institution which currently governs, I think, philosophical practice. After that, I try to sketch out what would come later, but that's like not really ready. That's more sketch than the other parts, because that would connect to the fourth chapter. The third chapter, it's a discussion about philosophy in Brazil. So it's about the problem of, it's a national problem, because we are ashamed of doing philosophy in a sense, and it's something that speaks to the problem of speaking in philosophy in Brazil, because we have there's this philosopher from here, which is Bento Prado, that he says that the subject of philosophy in Brazil is always a future subject. We are always asking what the conditions of philosophy would be in Brazil. So we are always afraid of doing philosophy in a sense, and that model what type of philosophy we do in the university, which I think is very different from other places in the world. And I'm reducing other places to America, England, Italy, Germany, and France, of course. But I think we are in a different place because the majority of philosophy here is history philosophy. We don't have much space for analytical philosophers, or the philosophy done in the US, in the kind done in the US departments. And we also don't have much French theory here in the sense that as a creative tradition. The French theory that we have here is mostly read as a historical subject. And the last part would be talking about, the last chapter would be talking about what should we do? What are the paths that we have available to us from this picture I painted in the previous chapters? And of course, that's the more or less open part of the book. But my suggestion, and I think it's very much in the spirit of this group, so it's not without saying that I was very much inspired by what was going on here, where I think, to take a metaphor from football, I think the philosopher is some sort of false nine. I don't know how much you guys follow, but if you've ever saw Roberto Firmino playing, he plays for Liverpool. He's like a forward, a striker, but he doesn't score goals. He's the piece that makes other people work. So in a sense, he has he's like, it's something that Gabriel once said that I think was very good, that the philosopher is the second best person to talk about any subject. And I think in a sense, that's what the path for philosophy might be. But I'll focus on the presentation I have here, and then we can talk later. Let me just share my screen. And there will be many terrible drawings in the slides. I apologize, you all, but I still haven't gotten the hang of doing good presentations that are intelligible to everyone. So, like I said, I'll be talking about the institutional bonds of philosophy, and two things that I've been trying to trace that are the structures and the paths in philosophical institutions. I'm not really committed to structure or path. It's not a technical term. It's just something that I've used to differentiate between 2 points of view that I'll be adopting here. Well, to start, I'd just like to present, I think it's a what I call the linear path of Platonic philosophical activity, which is in a sense what a philosopher does when he is faced with philosophy, if you are in a sense a Platonist. And I think that's a good start because, well, I do think Whitehead is right. Everything is in a sense a footnote to Plato, especially in the sense of where philosophy begins. And philosophy for Plato always begins with a wonder. There is an event that is something that is beyond our capacity to comprehend, but this event nonetheless appears to us as some sort of experience. And the fact that it appears to us as a different kind of experience is something that would be something that would appear to us through the desire to repeat this sort of experience. This is basically what Plato says in the Symposium, because what is falling in love? Falling in love for Plato is, in a sense, there's someone that you're interested. You don't know why you are interested, but it's an experience that there's an excess that makes you want to continue experiencing it. So this experience leads us to repetition, and through repetition, we identify common traits about the lover or about whatever this experience is. In a sense, this is the point where we start making concepts. But in Plato's case, he will say that, oh, we start to realize that when we love someone, there's this thing that we like, and I don't know if you guys like to watch Love is Blind or crappy shows like that, but I really do enjoy. I really love the Japanese version. I think they are all great. They really it's a great place to do comparing national traits, I think. And what's great about the Japanese version, and I think it's present in pretty much all reality shows in Japan that I saw, is that there's one question that they will always ask, which is, what is your type? And like, they really mean that. Like, the type is, oh, I'm a hard worker. Oh, I have my face like this. I have hair like that. So it's like there are actually traits that are extracted from sensible reality and that are used as guiding threads for how to move in the love world. Well, Plato says that, of course, that's part of it, but Plato is a Greek, so he pretty much likes to screw around everybody, I think. And he says quite clearly that you don't stick to the first person you fall in love. You will eventually find out that you will know more about love when you have more experience of love. And that allows us to go up into abstraction, where we go from sensible traits to concepts. But concepts, as we know, they are not final definitions. And in Plato's case, it's pretty much the starting point for when we go in direction of the idea, which is something we do through the process of the elenchus, which is the examination of the ideas. And in Plato, we never really get to the ideas. There's no final definition of beauty, justice, love, or whatever. But they do, in a sense, and I think that's the main point for philosophy, they displace the subject. They displace the subject that asks and puts him in a different perspective. So I'd say that this is it's like a pretty bare bone structure of what goes on in Plato's dialogues. Of course, they are not all the same. This is based mostly on the Symposium, but I do think that there is a structure here that can be adapted to most of Plato's dialogues. And this leads me to question, well, from that experience, from that concrete experience of philosophy that Plato tries to outline, I think we can deduce three different questions for philosophy. What is philosophy as an activity? What is philosophy as a wisdom? And what is philosophy as a tradition? An activity is because I think this is was the main problem that I faced in my PhD dissertation. I wanted to know what the hell was the effect of philosophy when someone is doing philosophy. Like what changes? What happens? What is this? What is this concept dealing with? How does dealing with concepts change my life? And in a sense, and this is all very, very generic, I think the activity of philosophy is a way of situating oneself in the world, which is basically the problem of the good life. This is mostly inspired by Pierre Hadot, the French historian of ancient philosophy, that said that philosophy is a series of exercises that takes us in the direction of the good life. So, in a sense, philosophy is an activity. I think we can say that even though it may change, it is basically an exercise. And I don't think that's only something that works for example, the Stoics, because I think Marcus Aurelius is probably the main name here when we talk about spiritual exercises, which is the concept that Pierre Hadot developed. I think that when, for example, we take a book like the Ethics, Spinoza's Ethics, there is an exercise where you are going through propositions and demonstrations, and that effectively leads you elsewhere. I think the act of leading someone elsewhere is the exercise of philosophy in a sense. But it's not simply leading someone elsewhere, because philosophy also has a content. It is not only an activity, but it is something that we might say that we actually develop something. And this is developed in my mind, and also this is very Platonist, through the facing of plural and inconsistent opinions. This is like what happens in every dialogue of Plato. Someone like, for example, the Laches, I think. It's like we have two generals who have different views on what courage is. And what's interesting is not only that one of the generals has a right opinion on what courage is, but the fact that, well, since there's a good faith that, well, they're both generals, they were both good at war, so in a sense, there must be some truth to what both of them are saying. And the problem of philosophy in terms of content would be trying to discover the idea that resists. And in a sense, I think that's what Plato tries to do through his method of division and collection. We divide concepts on their natural joints, we seek their natural joints, and we try to unify common traits on other content, on concepts. So philosophy is division and collection through Plato. That would be what I'm saying is the conceptual aspects. And finally, there's the problem of philosophy as a tradition, because not only do we do stuff, not only do we think stuff, but there's also a social aspect of this, in the sense that we are always linking ourselves with stuff that we more or less recognize as philosophy. This is not to say that there is a tradition, like a whole tradition, but in a sense, I would say that when we say tradition, we are talking about the effective bonds we establish with other people, be them alive or dead, that without us knowing completely, we are somehow attracted or repulsed by them. So I would say that the problem of tradition is the establishing of common ground and the mapping of divergences. I enjoy very much a book by, I think it's Randall Collins. I don't remember exactly, but he has a giant book. I only read the introduction, which was large enough, but it's history, the sociology of philosophy. And he has a very good definition of philosophy as in its social aspect, which is philosophers philosophy, because his question is, how does philosophy progress? And he says that philosophy progresses when when there are people who engage with one another in a group-like manner, but also when they, as a group, engage with other groups in hostile manners. So he describes the history of philosophy as this interchange, this dispute between different groups that form along its history. And he actually thinks that, well, the problem with current philosophy, because I think everybody wants to give their opinion, he'll say that philosophy is currently stuck because people aren't reading their enemies enough. They're only reading their in-groups. And in a sense, I think that makes sense if you consider how universities organize themselves. So in a sense, this would be, oh, I forgot to translate the end here, sorry. There would be an existential aspect, a conceptual aspect, and a social aspect of philosophy. And this would compose philosophy as a sort of form of navigation. It's not something that's overly determined. Actually, that is the problem that I've been trying to develop. What the hell is this navigation, and how is it different from other types of navigation? Well, so we have these problems, and how would we think these problems how would we think that generic structure in regard to one specific type of philosophy? That's why I say I'm focusing on Platonic philosophy and academic philosophy, because so we can have some means of comparison. But how do we say this? So after what I've said, well, Plato's philosophy always starts as a practice that is pluralized, or so like you have many generals who have courage, but they have different types of courage. When we talk about this, we say our opinions. That's where the doxa comes from. That's the discourse point. And in this point, we are making explicit our practices through discourse. But what we find out, and this is basically what happens in every Platonic dialogue, especially the early dialogues, is that, wow, people have different opinions about different stuffs. So about the same stuff. So we have a discourse that is equivocal, in the sense that we cannot assign only one opinion to one practice, one type of practice. Like, for example, we cannot explain correctly. We cannot decide together what is a just life by simply talking, because what we find out when we start to talk about justice is that everyone is talking different shit. So how do we do philosophy? This is where the conceptual element appears. Socrates will try to reason with people, will examine ideas, will seek out contradictions, will try to see what's absurd or not. And this would, in a sense, point him toward the form or the concept of what he is trying to discuss. For example, in the Republic, there is an attempt to see, well, we want to know what the just life is, what justice is. We present our discourses, and everybody, when talking about the Republic, generally focuses on Thrasymachus, who says that justice is the will of the strong. But in the first book, there are many definitions of justice, and Socrates, he deconstructs them all in a sense. But they are not happy with that. They won't let Socrates leave. So he starts trying to answer what justice is. But it's at this point that the question changes from, I think a person who I think made it clear for me what this displacement was John Bova, even though I may be using it right because I don't speak Greek, but in a sense, it's like we go from asking what is X to how is X, in the sense that we start asking what this, how it is that we speak of something that is common, that is present in every practice that we are trying to uncover. So we go beyond simply trying to differentiate between different opinions, and we start discussing what a concept is. That is actually what philosophy is for Plato always. It is never about any specific concept. It is always about what the forms are, in a sense, because even though he may not, and this appears especially when we are talking about the form of the good. There's many discussions about the moral content of this concept, but when we actually read the later dialogues like Philebus, the Sophists, Parmenides, we see that actually the good is more akin, and the Republic also, the good is more akin to the structuring of the world. There's, in a sense, a mathematical inspiration than any type of moral disposition. So we get to see that there is an idea of justice, but we don't know what justice is. But we do know, and this is what philosophy does, that if we are acting justly, we are, in some sense, participating in the act, participating in the idea of justice. So, in a sense, philosophy is to face your finitude as a subject, as a known subject for Plato, and when facing that limit, you displace the question in a manner that will displace your practice. Because even if you don't know the content of justice, we could do this. We could reduce a bit of Plato into Kantianism, because that's actually what I do all the time. The idea, in a sense, it's a regulative idea. It doesn't have to. You don't have to actually develop the idea so you can change your actions. If you know, for example, that there is an idea of justice, you would, in a sense, try and act according to it, even if you don't have a consistent discourse on it. Of course, there are many problems with the structure, and this is basically what Plato will develop in his later dialogues. But I think, in a sense, that this is the structure of how philosophy develops in his thought. And well, if we seek and try to see how we do philosophy in our time, it is a bit different. We don't discuss practices, we don't discuss in the agora, and we definitely don't aim at the ideas. This may be, in comparison, I think the Platonic version of the structure of philosophical activity I'm giving out is maybe a myth of origin. And so I think it's not, I don't really care if philosophy was actually that. I think there's a different status of the Platonic philosophy, especially due to it being considered the origin of philosophy or philosophical tradition in the West. But I think it gives us a good base for comparison. And so, and actually, if we see how philosophy was done in the ancient times, it was basically, you heard some ideas, like I heard some maxims from Epicurus or from the Stoics, and then I decide to join their schools, and then I learn about what happens in the schools, and then I'm philosophizing and discussing about life. What we do in the present tradition in academic philosophy is quite boring in comparison. We basically have texts in tradition, we select singular works, and we question what are their meanings. It's something, well, at least for me, it's something I learned to love with time, but it's actually pretty dull, because all you're doing is reading old books or new books, but they're treated as old, and you are seeing what you're trying to respond to them. You never leave this plane, I think, because it's something that for me was quite striking, because if you compare it with the content of philosophy, it seems that for most philosophers, philosophy was, in a sense, something that gave sense to life, at least in appearance, from a distance. And what do we do with texts? And this is basically an analysis that was based on an essay by Paulo Arantes, which is in his book about USP, which is the overseas French department, because he talks about Martial Guerrero and the philosophy in Brazil before its institutionalization. Well, when we are faced with philosophical texts, there are two things we can do. We can do discourse system analysis, which seeks to unveil its formal truth. And here it's like we're talking about Guru that gets Spinoza and tries to identify the system that exists in the ethics. It's like mostly these types of analysis are eminent commentaries. They try to explain a text from inside the text. But there are also historicist commentary. I think for example, I don't know if it's a good example, but it's something that I was reading recently, so it's in my mind. When you take, for example, Heinrich's biography of Marx, in a sense, that's a historicist commentary in the sense that he's trying to give context. I'm not really, I think historicist is such a vague term and everybody uses in a different way. So not trying to think it as one specific tradition, just trying to differentiate when you're talking about a text within the text or when you're talking about the text, relating it to other stuff. And basically what we do when we do this type of discourse system analysis is we create secondary literature, basically. So we're constructing a bibliographical network. We're doing articles about Spinoza or Nietzsche or whatever that, in a sense, will help other people do more analysis. So, for example, I had part of my thesis, part of my dissertation was about, I talked about Spinoza and Deleuze, and people were like, oh, you have to engage with secondary literature. And of course, it's important to engage with secondary literature. We all know that we can learn a lot, but it's rarely explained how one secondary literature will actually help you. It's mostly something that will, it's mostly a habit, I think. But there's another way of doing philosophy that is something that is shameful in a sense, where instead of discussing the system, like what is Plato's system, what is Spinoza's system, we are discussing the material truth in this text. For example, so it's like when you're talking about Kant and you say, oh, no subject, no transcendental subject exists. Like, what the hell is that? That doesn't exist. Or the transcendental subject exists, and I will show you why. I don't know about you guys, but every time someone engages a text like that, I get a bit cringy because it's like, it's as if the person doesn't have any, it's as if there's no ironic distance to the text. It's like, this is not right, this is not the moment, this is not how we do stuff. But in a sense, when people discuss the material truth of the text, or in a sense, or in other words, the thesis that are defended in the text, they either refute the thesis or they establish some sort of affiliation. So they are either for the thesis or against the thesis with reasons, but they construct something discussing the references and not concerned with the system. They're not trying to explain the system. They're trying to engage with the system. And the result of that is the establishment of a new reference. I think for me, especially because of my Deleuzian past, I think that a book like Difference and Repetition is an example of how to do that in the academic university. Deleuze, he never says, this is my idea. this is my concept of difference, because I think that would be cringe. What he does is just he discusses the philosophers he is in the tradition: Leibniz, Aristotle, Kant, Plato, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and then he positions himself within as another actor in this in the sequences he is establishing, but always constructing a new position. So he's not concerned in these books, like what is Spinoza's what is the difference in Spinoza of modes, substance, and attributes. He doesn't concern himself with that in difference and repetition. He does that in his book about Spinoza. What he actually does in difference and repetition is say, well, Spinoza has a good position when he's talking about expression, but we don't need any substance. So Nietzsche helps us with that. He does stuff like that when he's talking about the universality of being. So there's this sort of freedom, I think, when dealing with the text, that it's very hard to combine in the university. But when it does combine, this new reference joins the textual tradition. So, and in a sense, it supplies the people who are working inside the university with references to compare when they are analyzing the material truth. And it also inspires interpretative paradigms for the formal truth analysis. So, for example, I could say that in a sense, when I read, when people like, we can think about the structuralist craze in the 60s. It was a paradigm that was extracted from linguistics, from anthropology or whatever in France. And it was applied to anything. And it could even be applied to a philosophical analysis in a sense. So basically what we do in academic philosophy, we are faced with these two choices: constructing secondary literature for most of us, or trying to do new references, build new references. But like I said, I think there's a shame in trying to do your own philosophy, and that's actually what happened in Brazil. Philosophers before the 70s and 60s in Brazil, they were like reading Heidegger and Schelling and German idealism, and trying to talk about the Brazilian spirit, national spirit, and talking about Sartre as if everything was in the same plane. And in a sense, it is. But since we are all academic, because that's what USP, the main university in philosophy in Brazil, did, they killed every philosophy outside of what was done in the university. When we see people doing this stuff, we think it's a bit weird. I don't think it's true for analytic circles, because I think in a sense, philosophy is in the Anglo tradition. They have a sense that they are constructing new references. But as a friend of mine has said recently, the difference maybe between what we are doing here in Brazil mostly and what people are doing in American and English departments is that they have an English primary literature. I think maybe that's the difference. And well, if you see, there are many discussions about, like, for example, I think that's the hot topic in the moment is embodied cognition, questions in philosophy of mind, the hard problem, whatever. And well, of course, there are people who are actually maybe doing progress with that, but I think mostly people are probably doing meta discussion, in the sense that they are discussing the contributions of other people. So I guess I think that can be generalized, but I still have to think about that a bit. Well, that would be the structure of philosophical problems. But what interests me, as I said, is not only the structure of problems or how we do philosophy, but what ties philosophy together. That's why I had on the title, The Institutional Bonds of Philosophy. And I think someone who lets us see this in a quite clear manner is Badiou in his essay, What is a Philosophical Institution, Address, Transmission, and Inscription, which was a text that Gabriel recommended to me right before I started working on this material. And he has a pretty clear structure of what an institution is that is summed up in these diagrams. First, he says what philosophy isn't. Philosophy, what an institution isn't. Sorry, and the philosophical institution is not an effect of doing philosophy. It is not a collection of philosophical texts, and it is not something that has a use value. Because for Badiou, which is, I think it's a pretty standard position in philosophy, even though he may have his specificities, philosophy has no ends. There are no finalities in the philosophical practice. And the reason he gives for that is because if philosophy had an end, in a sense, it would be achieved. We would know what to do. And all the errancy that we find in philosophy would be absent. So how does he describe a philosophical institution? A philosophical institution is not what comes about from philosophy, but is actually what allows philosophy to exist, in a sense. It is the knot that ties philosophy. And this knot has three elements. It has a problem, which is usually discussed by Badiou as a void, and this void is some sort of address. It has disciples who transmit this voice, and these disciples end up writing books, which is the inscription of the void in a way that other people can experience this initial void of philosophy. But there's this can be described as a certain path, because you have, in a sense, a subjective position, which is a void, something that is, I'm not being too technical because I don't think he is at that essay. There's a subjective position in the sense that there's a problem, a question that has no positive, is not positively defined. It is just something that, let us say, I like to, when I talk about this, I like to remember this essay by Patrice Moniglet, which is a scholar in French structuralism. He says that philosophy starts not when things break down, like the Heideggerian hammer. Philosophy starts when things work, in the sense that we do not understand how things work. And this is in itself a source of amazement, of wonder. So there's this void that addresses a question, and it is a question without destination. So this has no community, and Badiou makes a joke with the French Post because apparently it's not really good. But even though you address a question to no one, it meets someone, and it meets whichever subject. It doesn't matter who. There are no. If we are trying to be vulgar Spinozists, it's a matter of encounter. And once you hear this dispatch, this question, you have a choice to make. You can choose to hear it and support what it means, or you can leave it. And the process of becoming a philosopher, in a sense, is being someone who entertains the question at hand. And I think this is very much, I think, well, of course, Badiou is a Platonist, but I think it's very much the problem of love, in a sense, because when we love someone, we cannot explain why we love someone. and we choose, and I think that's his point in his essays on love. We choose to be faithful to something that we do not understand quite completely, and this is a struggle. It is a struggle to face a question that was not addressed to us, but that in a sense attracts us. And this is what makes a disciple. And a disciple, if the subjective position that starts philosophy is a void, the disciple is put on the side of the finite. He will be one particular form of receiving this void. And the disciple, well, he will, once he has struggled and kept close to the question, he has two paths for him. He can build a school, and that's actually what Plato does. And he can also try and face the void, but not from the point of view of someone who is simply interested, but someone who has already stayed near to this question. And in a sense, the disciple then will try to inhabit the void. And in inhabiting the void, he will try and write the void. And that's what philosophers do. They are faced with the question, and there's like the whole tradition of philosophy that's Heidegger, I think, is most famous for this, but I think it's something we can find pretty much all over the place, where there is also an unthought element in a philosopher's thought, which is what drives him. So I think this is what a disciple would do. He is one singular path, one singular form of receiving this call, and he tries and develop this through marking this void. And the mark of the void is, the point is that this void can be infinitely marked. And the effect, the product of this marking are the books. Just 1 second, I think. And these books are offered to anyone. And from that, we can restart the process, because anyone who reads a book of philosophy is faced with, in a sense, the void that started this whole quest. So what I did, and this is what I'll be doing for the next slide, is trying to apply this sheen in regards to Platonic philosophy, academic philosophy, and something that is very sketchy, but would be non-academic philosophy. And I think it's quite unsurprising that Badiou's structure of the philosophical institution, it maps pretty nicely with how Plato does philosophy. The void is the Socratic ignorance. That is the whole problem that starts the philosophy in Plato. What is this person who talks, who says nothing, who knows nothing, and yet he continues to attract me near him? And there's a void in Socrates in the sense that he really does know nothing, but the meaning of this nothing is what is interpreted all over Plato's dialogues. So there's this dispatch from Socratic ignorance, which generally takes the form of the question of the good. I single out the question of the good because it is, in a sense, the most important question in Plato's dialogues, but it's in the background of every question he puts. And it's a question that, in a sense, is addressed to all of Athenian society. And when I think this maps out pretty good with the fact that it's, because, as I said, Badiou says that philosophy is directed at nobody, no community. There's no community for philosophy. And if you know, and if we take what Karatani says of Athenian society, and also what other scholars have said, of course, about Athenian democracy, we know that it was a city of demagogues, and that there's no there really is no, it was a surprise that somebody would be there to hear the questions that were being raised by Socrates. And it is in this, in the wanderings of Socrates that we will meet this young man, Aristotle. I really have no idea if this is actually his name. My source is currently only Wikipedia, but that's fine. I think haven't put it on paper, but there is this discussion about the name of Plato, because Plato was a nickname, and some people have said that his name might be Aristotle. And I've decided to put here because he was not a philosopher to begin with. He was actually just a pretty rich boy who wanted to be Sophocles or Euripides, probably. He wanted to write tragedies, and he probably wrote pretty good. But then he encountered Socrates, and then he burned his tragedies. At least that's what the legend says. And I think that can be said as a choice. And Plato starts to be a follower of Socrates. And I think this is important because this is not a quick path. Because even though it's like he becomes Plato in the graphic, we know that Plato started publishing his dialogues pretty late in his life. His first dialogue was only published after Socrates' death. So in a sense, he was very mature by that point. But he takes up Socrates' address, and then he does two things. He builds the Platonic Academy, which is a structure for repeating and preserving the Socratic void, and he attempts to decipher the void. He attempts to occupy the point of Socrates, and he literally occupies the point of Socrates. There's even one letter, which I think it's one of my favorite letters. It's a pity that it's one of the false ones. I think it's the second letter, where Plato says quite clearly, there is no Socrates. This is all invention. And I think, in a sense, what this means, even if it's a fake letter, but I mean, once I discovered that the earliest copy of a Platonic dialogue that we have news was 150 years after Plato's death, I think God is dead after that. So when we talk about fake and true letters, what does it even mean if he was dead like 150 years after that? Of course, that's not what the scholars will tell you, but okay. But Plato really tries to occupy that point, and we see that he tries to occupy it because you can see that there is a difference between the youth dialogues, which are the aporetic dialogues, where like, oh, what is courage? This, or it's that. Oh shit, it's none of that. And then there are the mature dialogues, like, oh, what the hell is an idea? Oh, what is justice? And then he tries to do something and not stay in an aporetic stance. So I do think, in a sense, he tries to suture or inscribe the Socratic void through the Platonic dialogues. And in a sense, it's not a final. It's not as if Plato is saying this was Socrates. It's as if he's trying to literally repeat the gesture of Socrates after being his disciple. And the Platonic dialogues, as we know, they are offered to tradition. There's all this. I think it's very. I don't like this, but there's all this talking about the unwritten doctrines of Plato, and frankly, I think it's. Of course, Plato probably had unwritten doctrines in the sense that there was stuff that was discussed that was not completely put out in the dialogues. But I think there's a fetish that Plato's true philosophy would be in his oral teachings and not in his writings. This is something we can discuss. I don't like this position because first, I think it disconsiders that actually writing in ancient times was not something so simple. It's very expensive. So I think for starters, there's a material problem. Why the hell would he preserve so much of his writing? And Plato also has this this specific element that I think is very important to remember. We have very little remains of ancient philosophical texts. We have like 30% of what we think Aristotle's corpus was. We have none of the books by the founders of Stoicism. We only have some maxims of Epicurus and some letters. Most of what we have of ancient texts was commentary by Aristotle that was written 500 years after Christ. So it's pretty weird that we have all of Plato's dialogues. I mean, they really were trying to preserve them. And this is very interesting. It actually has to do with, this is just an aside, but it has to do in a sense with, how do you say that in English? It has to do with copyright. Because in ancient times, when you had a book, you would go to the bookstore and then they would copy out the book for you and they give you a copy. And then so you distributed your books in bookstores and people would sell them. And then like when they went to other places, they would get out of the books, and then it worked like that. The genius of Platonic Academy is that it tried to concentrate the selling of the Platonic dialogues. Like, we are your source for the dialogues. We have the correct text. So I think that helps see that there's a lot of effort in trying to preserve these texts. But as what Badiou had said, these texts are the starting point for another trip into the Socratic ignorance. It's just like the Twilight Zone. There's a Twilight Zone, and then there's the Socratic Twilight. I don't know. I have to make better jokes. But how would we try and describe this process currently? That's what my starting point, in a sense, was. That's why I was circling around all the history of philosophy. Well, I tried to discuss earlier what philosophers do, and this is how I think it would map out into the philosophical institution scheme done by Badiou. We have texts in the tradition. These are void. And we can see that they are void because there are all those cliches. It's a never-ending interpretation, or I read a text hundreds of times and it's always a different text. It's like, I don't know, some of you guys probably saw it. I think David Harvey's lectures on Marx, there are the podcast versions, and he's like, every year I read these texts and I'm like, it's a different text. And of course, I get it that it's a new text, but I don't think it's every time. I mean, for the last 2 years, I've been teaching classes about certain philosophical texts, and I'm like, I'm sick. I don't know how Harvey can teach Capital 30 years in a row. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not made for the university. Maybe that explains some things about my trajectory. But that is how the university says what philosophy is. There are texts, and we will be commenting on them endlessly. And the question that we ask is not, oh, is this text true? Is deconstruction something real? Or what are the Foucault stuff? Are the structures of disciplining and punishing, are they like real structures? Well, maybe that's what people do in sociology departments, in anthropology departments. But when we study Foucault in philosophy, We are asking what are the concepts of Foucault. We don't care about reality. We are only trying to unfold or structure the concepts themselves. So we ask, what is the meaning of the text? And of course, like I said, the text can be, we can have two types of answers, but the most common answer is not regarding the material truths of the text, maybe in other departments, but in philosophy, we are only concerned with the formal truth of the text. So the text is pointed towards an academic institution, and that academic institution is a place where people are taught and people get degrees. We don't have a whichever subject. We don't have rich boy Plato strolling around Athens, finding this crazy man walking barefoot. We don't have that. Like we need a degree, and in the case of Brazil, philosophy is considered an easy degree because it's a short course and because it's not as sought out like law or journalism, which is weird because there are no jobs in journalism also. So I don't understand that. But you have a philosophy student, and then he generally arrives at the course. I don't know, maybe he read some existentialist texts when he was a teenager, or maybe he just wanted to get a degree, but he's there. He's a philosophy student before being interested in anything, I think. And when he gets in the university, he is constantly faced with this question with what is the meaning of the text? I mean, I loved all my teachers in my undergrad classes, not all of them, but I love all my teachers, but we were never asking, is this correct? Is this right? Is this interesting? What is this worth? And I do get it. It's something that is very hard to measure when you're talking about university life, when you're talking about distribution of resources, financial resources, grants. You need to have a way to measure how people work. You need to compare people's work. And it's so much harder, I think, to compare different takes at material truth than different takes at formal truth. I mean, you can have, and that's something that's, I think, that's pretty visible in Brazil when we talk about how do you get into a university. We have this, they generally have like a question, which is, what is being? What is beauty? And then you have to write like 5 to 10 pages on what the hell being or beauty is. And you're not allowed to say what you think being or beauty is. You have to say, oh, Plato thought what being was this. Being was an idea. And then Aristotle says, no, you have to talk about universals or whatever. That's what you do. And why do you do that? Because imagine if you have to correct 20, 30 essays to discover who is the best candidate. If someone's saying, oh, I think the transcendental subject exists, and another person is saying the transcendental subject doesn't exist, it's very hard to compare what's going on. I mean, it's like, it would be excellent. I think this was done in the 19th century in Brazilian philosophy. There was this school, Pedro II, where actually it was done like that. They asked, what is a spirit? And then you had to define a fucking spirit in the essay. And I think those were glorious times maybe. But nowadays, there are too much people, and you have to have a means of measuring the differences. And so if you have 10 people talking about Plato and being, you have the text of Plato where you compare. So in a sense, I think that it makes sense for the textual meaning of philosophy to be the main point. I think this is something that I work out in some other places in the book project, but I think it's important to put it out there. So a philosophy student, he arrives in class and he's like, oh, we're going to talk about justice. And that's generally what happens to conservatives. May God be torturing his soul right now, but Olavo de Carvalho, which was like our Alexander Dugin, he had like the idea that when people go into university, they are very they are shocked, they're unhappy, because they think they are going to discuss the nature of the good, the nature of justice, the nature of the beautiful. And then people are just like talking, what is the concept of beautiful in Kant and Hume? And in a sense, I think it makes sense that people are frustrated. And I think it makes sense that people will go on and do his online philosophy courses. But if you persist in this structure, in this institution, you persist because in a sense, you have learned to love this question. And it is not something good, something easy, something good. Like that's maybe what I'm thinking. But it is not something easy. It is a struggle. It is a material struggle having to learn all the secondary texts on the authors you are going to do your PhD dissertation on, but it's something that will make you a professional philosopher. So in a sense, what is a professional philosopher? This is a definition by Paulo Arantes, which I think is very good. He is a professional, he is a professional reviewer of philosophical bibliography. What he does is know how to move around between secondary texts regarding to one author. And you can get a job, and you can get grants, and you can do everything in philosophy institutionally if you develop these abilities. And what do you do as a professional philosopher? You are employed in a university which structures this academic institution. Because philosophy, in a sense, it has its form because of the way universities are structured, because there is a need to distribute grants and resources. You need to, the way philosophy needs to be something that it's legible by the people who have the money. So a professional philosopher is employed at university departments, but he does not coincide with the text and tradition. He will never do that cringe stuff of thinking he himself is a philosopher. And I'm not even saying I agree with this. I have very mixed feelings. I think currently my position is something that is expressed in a fable that a teacher of mine told. He said that Nietzsche says that philosophers have long legs because they go from peak to peak. They go like from big ideas to big ideas. And then this teacher, who was actually someone who had very long legs, but he hid it, he said, we are not Nietzsche. We don't have long legs. So we have to go down the mountain, and then we have to go up the mountain. I think there's a humbling aspect in this that it's very worth preserving, but if we don't forget to climb the mountain back up, I mean, if we're just going down infinitely, this is crap. But if you do go back, I think there's some preserving in this. But I think this table also encapsulates, in a sense, what we do in philosophy. We do not do big ideas. We interpret the text and the tradition and produce exegetical commentary, either of the immanent type or the historicist type. And from this, we produce bibliographical networks. For example, in Brazil, we have two competing traditions of Nietzscheanism. There's this Nietzscheanism that exists in the University of São Paulo, which is like, oh, life is will to power. This is life, this is cool. We are all quantums of force going through the universe. And then there's like the analytical Nietzscheanism that's starting to make way in Brazil, which is like, we are trying to understand what is the science that Nietzsche used when he wrote Gay Science and whatever. they're all interesting in their own way. Actually, not the USP one, but the end point is the same. They produce secondary literature that is fed back into the academic institution. So in a sense, we never get to experience the fundamental void of tradition, of philosophy in this network. I think in a sense, we are barred from that. But so what? What do we do? This is the part where I'm not so sure, because in the book project that I had, this from this part I would discuss the problem of shame in Brazil, so I could provide a specific answer that was relevant to Brazil's situation, and that is where I arrive at the idea that the philosopher is the false nine. He is the player who assists other players who will strike the goal. But since I had to finish this, because in a sense this was a presentation that I had worked out for some other place, but I thought it would be good to present here. I think this is a attempted portrait in the sense of what I think many of us are trying to do. You may not identify yourself in this picture, that is okay. But I think it captures what would be the path for a philosophy in a non-academic institution. And I maintain non-academic because this is not philosophy simply outside the university. This is philosophy that is done as a response to not being able to find a place in the university. Because I think that is actually the matter at hand. There is a failure involved in this specific path where you, of course, you want a job, but you don't get a job. And then when you try and discover why you didn't get a job, you see that maybe you were going the other way. Maybe there are some autobiographical vibes here. I do have my moon is in Leo, so that explains much, I think. What is the void currently? I think the void, instead of being a void, it's a void in the manner of an excess. We are disoriented. We are disoriented. I don't know. I can't speak English. I'm sorry. There's a disorientation at the root of our questioning. We have too much information, too much stimuli. We have too much everything. And this excess puts a question, which is the meaning not of texts, but of the world. So in a sense, it is a structure of philosophy that I think is intimately linked to modern society, to the excess produced by modern society. And this modern society will produce these people I'm calling floating subjects, but just for lack of anything better, which are just people who are there, who might be interested or might not, but who may be, who may face an encounter that puts them with the question of the meaning of the world. And I think this is something that cannot be too much explained, because we have all seen how contingent our beginnings in philosophy generally are. For example, my beginning in philosophy was simply because I was trying to read what an ex-girlfriend read at the time, and she didn't want to share it with me. So I wanted to get into her world. So it has no meaning of life. It's completely arbitrary, but in a sense, it's what put me down in this path. And it put me in this path, which is a transmission through studying. And I differentiate studying from qualification, which was on the other diagram, because it will not necessarily put you on the track to enter the job, the place where philosophers get jobs, which is the university. So these floating subjects, they are generally divided actually, because they do generally enroll in the university for some reason or another. So they do get inside the university generally, but they are also developing their studies in a manner that they may not know it, but it does not always fit with the university. And I think this appears not when you are discovering what philosophy is and what the university can provide, but when you are unable to integrate the university or when you are rejected by the university. So in a sense, there would be these floating subjects. They would compose a class of non-integrated amateurs. I still have a lot of work to do on the nature of the amateur, but I do think there's this interesting point, because the amateur, he does not have the same relation of the professional. He's not interested only in the meaning of texts. He's moved by other stuff, and I'm defending here that he is moved, especially by this excess that produces disorientation. But non-integrated amateurs, they are ejected from the university generally, or they are not allowed to integrate. And as our dejects fall down the toilet, we will all meet as a disordered collective. Every one of us who was, in a sense, ejected, rejected, unable to integrate oneself, this is a magical thinking here, and it's not a telos. It's more like people ending up in the same place by matter of being rejected. Not doesn't mean everyone will go to the same place. There are too many toilets in the world, but people will meet. People will meet. This mainly due to the negative character of their meeting. But in a sense, this is something that I'm not quite sure. But these people who are together due to being unwanted or unintegrated, they will talk. They will talk, and they will try to understand what happened to them. It is generally very traumatic. And through these talks, they will be able to get to know the different reasons for their non-integration. And this is a path that I think leads these disordered collectives into autonomous networks, which is a more self-conscious group, which is not simply together due to it for a negative reason, but due to an effort to try and understand the non-integration, either being studying the problem of the university, or else trying to study things that don't have a place in the university. The point is that there will be an attempt to map and to accumulate a mass points of reference. So an autonomous network, in a sense, and this is maybe where I was thinking of this group. It really does seem as an accumulation of numerous points of reference that in this process structure a group, which is not only defined negatively, but through its own connections in trying to understand itself. Of course, it doesn't mean all groups will have this clear and easy path, and this is only a generic description. But in a sense, it's an attempt to try and see the paths that we have, what the paths we are going through when trying to deal with this different assortment of knowledges that are trying to be composed, that don't have really a place. So I'm trying to map out these paths, especially, and this is something that doesn't appear here, when we think that, well, there's one reason why people want to be integrated into the university. They want to have jobs. They want to have money. So in a sense, what's at stake here is trying to figure out the path for trying to make the research life possible financially, materially, when you are not in the university system. But that's another path. So in a sense, we have these three structures, which is only getting that earlier diagram, how they structure the void, transmission, and inscription. Platonic philosophy has ignorance of Socrates, which is transmitted through philosophers in dialogues. Academic institution has a tradition where professors do commentary, and non-academic institutions are dealing with the void of modern society. Maybe I'm doing too much heavy lifting, I know. Through amateurs, which are collectively constructing references. Well, that's what I had. I'm sorry for talking too much. Yeah, that's it. I need some water.
Nice. I have a comment / question, possibly. On that, the 2 pages when you were talking about the, I guess like the path through academic philosophy, and then your kind of like new problematic of the non-academic, I guess, possibilities. It reminded me a lot of this like disorientation that you mentioned of, I guess, Aurora Apolito's problematic that we've talked about a few times, of the mismatch between like size and complexity, right? Where like the systems that you have, when their complexity doesn't grow at like the rate at which the size of them grows. And it reminded me a lot that it seemed like the first diagram, just looking at like the structure of it, right? Almost everything that was the path through academic philosophy, it looked like almost all of like, I guess like the arrows, right? If you're looking at like the flow of it, kind of point towards the institution, right? So it's done in such a way that the work of philosophy in the institution is for its own reproduction, but its own reproduction in the same form that it was before, right? Whereas the second diagram, just looking at it the same way, just like kind of in terms of the flow, has this like kind of self-referential kind of looping, I guess, sense to it that at least gives me, I mean, I haven't really like dug obviously super deep, but it gives me, I guess, the vibe that has the potential maybe for more complexity. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I had in mind, because I think this is the problem of academic philosophy. It's very beautiful. It helps me a lot. I love understanding those Plato texts, but it only produces the same thing. And I think this is the problem, that it needs to justify itself in a resource distribution system. So I think it's kind of how to say, it's a vicious circle, because I think this is what you said was perfect, because there's no complexity that is being developed. And I don't know how, I think this kind of description could be used also for the way American philosophy is done generally in university departments, because it seems like people are only developing categories that have the main objective of allowing themselves to differentiate themselves in the institutional setting. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you guys saw that Phil Papers questionnaire. It was really incredible, as like from someone who was not from that world, where it was like, what is your position on the zombie problem, or whatever? Or your theory of time, is it theory of time A or B? So it's like, look, for me, it was very clear that philosophy is developing. It's like too hooked on its social aspect, in the sense that it's only making a community within itself. But I think there's a lack of complexity that comes from that, because what I was trying to do in a sense, and that's what I didn't develop much here, is that I think the way towards complexity can only come if the philosophical standpoint recedes from the main position. Because I agree with Badiou's takes more than Deleuze. I do think there's a way to mix the two, in the sense that philosophy creates concepts and philosophy organizes truth. And I think it's an error to think that philosophy constructs truth. What happens when we think that? I think maybe the academic institutions. We think the truths are there, so there's nothing more to do in a sense. But if we say that the truth procedures are outside of philosophy, it's even easier for us because we don't have to concern ourselves. I mean, it's pretty hard constructing truth. So I think philosophy can not worry itself about that and engage in the never-ending truth production that occurs outside of it. So I think there's it does not let itself access this complexity source, the source of complexity. I think Daniel raised his hand first.
Yeah, I think Daniel did raise his hand.
Okay. Hey everyone, congratulations on that. Really nice diagrams to go along with everything. I followed everything to the best that I can. I think I got a strong grasp on the project. Okay, a couple comments. One, the theory of disorientation is interest to me, precisely because I worry that the difference between those on the inside or those on the outside reinforces a kind of false Nietzschean Manichaeanism of what, like Alenka Zupančič calls winners and losers of neoliberalism. So one, it avoids a class analysis of that predicament, which more and more, like, for example, look at the Google results of what's called imposter syndrome. It didn't exist until you had post-2008. People didn't talk about this. Yeah, why? Because of a class dynamic. The people on the in are only allowed in vis-a-vis their class position, mostly, right? And the extent to which working class people are allowed in is diminishing and diminishing and diminishing, right? So I think there's that issue. I think the other issue is that, yes, you said something interesting, which is that those that work on the experience shame as an affect. Well, Lacan said those on the inside experience shame, right? And I think actually the 60s and 70s period was one in, like, why did Guy Debord have a radical ontological opposition to any collaboration or work with university, right? As a matter of an intellectual principle, yeah? Even Badiou's notion of anti-philosopher also. So there is a certain dignity that I would say is the opposite of what you're saying about how you could construct a community of disoriented intellectuals and so on without falling into an internalization of the liberal superego, which would say that there's presentation of the situation itself, right? And I think for those of us that are not formally in a university, we too must reject that construction, right? Because it reinforces that. So then yes, and then even the notion of imposter syndrome itself indicates that the inside of the core is undergoing a profound crisis, which is not reducible to identity and so on, but is an issue of knowledge and the recycling of knowledge, right? So there's that issue, but this is a very exciting project, and I support you 100% in it. I think it's fabulous. I really, really like it. I guess what I would say is, like, yeah, and even also, as you're reading in Deleuze, what does Deleuze mean by the minor? Well, as far as I know, it's actually a kind of extension in a way of what Badiou means by the anti-philosopher, right? So there's a certain relationality that the minor, or in your term, the amateur, has to something different than a kind of textualist, shameful university discourse, etc., right? So that's a strength, right? So I think that there's a certain strength that comes with that position, which should be affirmed. Why also? Because if we don't insist upon that as a decision, as a principal decision of what an alternative institution might be, then we're working within the super egoic logic of the system as it is, and we create that false hierarchy. Like Nietzsche's, it's not correct. Neoliberalism is not correct. It's not a world of winners and losers. That's what we're told, right? But why would we accept that? Why would we accept living in that framework? For me, okay, I'll stop. I was just, these are my comments. I'm very inspired by what you're doing.
I think I very much enjoyed your comments because I think they went to the heart of some things that I wasn't able to present here, because the only part of this project that is actually written down is an essay on shame in Brazilian philosophy. And there is a path, because I think this, what you said is very important. You do not want to make this into a resentful project, in a sense. It's not a matter of winners and losers. So what I tried to do when I was, it's very funny because this project, in a sense, it started very much talking a lot with Gabriel, Miriam, and Caron. There's this Brazilian philosopher, Paulo Arantes, where he is ashamed of liking philosophy. It's very clear. He is very ashamed of saying that he liked to read Aristotle in class when he was a young boy. And I wanted to understand that shame, because it's shameful. It really is shameful in Brazil in the 60s, where most of the population is still not, how do you say, alphabetized. They don't know how to write. And then there are, they're not literate. So it's really, there's a shame in this. And there's also the shame of not being European, which was what philosophy was in the 60s. So they do work out that shame in a way that I think is positive. What do? They take all the metaphysical explanations of why formal truths are important in philosophy, why Geroux was right in doing philosophy, in how he did history of philosophy, and they convert that into a system of teaching. We are in Brazil, we have this problem, we are going to teach texts. And that is how, that's like the first movement in this dialectics of shame that happens in Brazil. But the problem is that in the last 10 years, the university has only started to open up in Brazil in the last 10 years, and it's already closing down. But it's a moment where people who are not white, more women, trans, so everything is getting in the university. And it makes a lot of sense that people are pissed with what is taught at the universities. Not in the sense that they don't want to read Plato, but they have questions that are not answered. And there are two ways of dealing with shame in that circumstance in Brazil. One is what I think is it's a, how do you say, it's like, it's not a good way. It's like, oh, I studied Benjamin in art, now I will study Benjamin in politics. It's like something you can observe after 2013 in Brazil, people shifting their research programs into political questions. But aside from that, I think there's the creating of students, of a body of students that are ashamed of the fact that they are not represented, their questions are not present in philosophy, but they are also ashamed that they do enjoy those things that are against them. And I think it's in this dialectics of shame that the way out is. Not shame as a negative affect, but shame as, I think it's in the Imagine There's No Woman, where Kopchak puts a definition of shame, which is, I think it's, I don't know any of this Lacanian stuff, but you discover that the big other isn't there. I think it's something like that. Gabriel can help me because he gave me the quote. But it's this process of dealing with shame in another way. And this is why I think when you see what's been happening of interesting in philosophy in Brazil lately, it's more connected to people who I think incorporate this shame not as, oh, I'm against this, but as something that, well, there's a split inside me. I am this, and what I also am is against this. And there's no easy way out. You can, of course, try to deny that you like this, and then you will suffer. I have many examples of this, but I think that's a bad way of dealing, not a productive way of dealing with the shame. So I think you're right on point, because it's very important not to turn this project into a resentful project. So I agree.
Beautiful. And it would be like, there's so many layers of the shame, and the question of, let's say, the affective composition of the scene would necessitate, in my view, a new diagram from you that could kind of talk about these intricate ways that the institutions have their own, let's say, affective economies, if to use that phrase. Would be an interesting thing to diagram. But I unfortunately have to leave, my friends and comrades. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Beautiful. Bye.
Hey, I think I was the next one, right?
Yeah.
I think you started answering in your answer to Daniel already. I was kind of curious, is a clarification, I think, regarding our position in the USPian method, because it seems that you're very, you have this strong reference in Bento Prado Jr. and Paulo Arantes, were there at the first moment of integration of this French structural method of reading, and they were kind of proponents of it. They were all for it, right? In the implantation of a philosophical conscience in Brazil, something like that, or to enable Brazilians to do philosophy in a certain sense. This is pretty clear, even if Paulo Arantes is sometimes fairly critical of the philosophical profession. He's still to this day, and you can hear him saying in the last lives that he's doing, he's still to this day, he advocates the French structural method, because he says, oh, we learned to do good texts. We are producing good texts now. It's not like that bullshit that we were writing before, the advent of the, French department of Outremer, right? So there's an ambiguity there that I'm not sure if you inherit the ambiguity as well. Like, the ambiguity is there in Paulo Arantes, but at the same time, I wonder if you're inheriting in your model the same ambiguity. Like, what is really is there something? The fact that the philosophical activity in the university is mainly the production of text about texts, is kind of a product of this kind of structural reading kind of method. Paulo Arantes is a critic in the sense of a loss of a reference, and so it says something like this, because I don't believe really in identifying. Anyway, this is another issue. But he's criticizing that at the same time that he advocates it as a method. At the same time, this puts pressure on your account, for instance, of professional philosophy in the academy, because it seems to me if you have to uphold something positive about the structural method of reading that you are inheriting perhaps from Paulo Arantes and Bento Prado Jr. and those folks, you would have to at least say that the production of text about text is at least a necessary evil. And this is kind of my position in the academic discourse. On the academic, I don't know if Daniel knows it, but I have a university position. I'm not at all comfortable in the sense of, I wouldn't say shame, I wouldn't say that, but I'm not at all comfortable in my shoes in the sense of, adhering to the ethics of paper production and publishing in so and so and so. And these are the accredited places that you have to publish in this kind of things that are the result, as you mentioned, I think correctly, of the fact that this production has to be measured by something outside of philosophy, like the value of this kind of research. So you're importing some other kind of valuing method or measure to measure, the production of philosophical texts. So there's this side to that. this is not the good side, or this is not at least the necessary evil, I'd say, I'm not sure. But the necessary evil is also because about, don't think sometimes, I'm sure you know, sometimes the opposite pressure is true as well. So it's a good thing that they can just write a text about a text sometimes. And when I teach a class, it's very hard to demand of them, hey, define, as you gave an example before, define the spirit from what's your opinion on it? What's your position? This is pretty hard to do, to demand of a student. So sometimes doing text on text is a liberation in a certain sense, and it is a mean to learn a certain kind of craft, which is the Paulo Arantes Bento Prado argument for the structural method. So I think there are some internal threads. I would say something like Daniel was saying, that there are some internal threads that may divide up your categories. Like you don't have only the professional philosopher in the academy or the amateur that is not in the academy. You have them both in the same person sometimes, and they are both in the teacher. They are both in the student. You see, sometimes it's good to write a text about a text because it liberates you from self-criticism. Oh my God, I can't really write a philosophical text. So just write a review. It's okay. You'll get a grade and you learn something by writing a review. That's not too bad. You see. So I think there's some complexity that I fear that you're maybe, at least in the way it was presented, you're kind of presenting as two tribes, the amateur and the professionals. And it seems sometimes that the professionals the professional way of doing things is bad, or is non-philosophical, not in the Lorellian sense. It's non-philosophical in the, I don't know,
bad sense.
Neither anti-philosophical, because anti-philosophy is good as well. But anyway, you understand what I mean. It's it's a non-thought or something like that, which is, I think, a dimension of the problem. I agree. But yeah, I think there's a whole lot of ambiguity that has to be dealt with in this problem. And there's this basis from which you start that has to do with the USP. And I feel you're critical of USP, but at the same time, you're starting from there. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I made myself clear enough, but I feel some distinctions are very clear cut, but at the same time, those same divisions are there in the things being divided. Like, as I said, it's in the teacher, it's in the student as well. So yeah, something like that. I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah.
Enough.
No, I think it's quite clear what you're pointing at, and I think there are two main points I think that you made. First, I would say that the distinctions between professional and amateur philosopher, they are very rough, and they are not intended to be precise, because I don't believe they're trying to capture more spirit than a precise division of this. So what I would say is, of course, I think it makes a lot of sense that some teachers some professors find themselves in those positions, and I don't think it touches the problem of the category. I would say it's more in the sense of like when we complain about something, and then we're talking, there are some people, and then like some people say, not all people, not all men. Like, if you are not all men, you don't even need, it's okay. Nobody's talking about you. So that's like I understand your point. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm just trying to clarify how I'm using these categories.
Just clarification. I'm not coming from the place that I feel attacked or anything. No, not at all.
No.
I'm just saying that perhaps this would change. This would change your diagram somewhat. This would change your the way you are dividing up things. Just that, like, what is the subject that is the professional philosophy? What is the subject is the amateur? Sometimes these subjects are the same person.
No, of course.
So in that sense, so are these individuals, people, or are these functions that may be instantiated by one and same person at different levels. For instance, I'm obliged to be that jerk of, that tries to publish in so and so and so, journals. I'm obliged because I have to do it because I'm a university professor, but this is not what I like at the same time. So you see, I'm just using myself as an example because it's pretty close to me, obviously. But not from the position that I feel attacked by in any way. Not talking about that.
No, yeah, no, of course, I get the point. I just think that maybe I'd have to work out how to position this divided subject in a more, maybe it's a matter of trying to see how I can, but I understand your point. I just think that, well, at least at this point, it's pretty much a rough cut. So I would say that one can occupy it's more of a function maybe than a category. And in regards to the ambiguity aspect, this is something that exceeded the presentation. But I think, in a sense, I'm a radical Uspian in the sense that you can only do philosophy by reading texts about texts. But the thing is, to cut it short, I think we have to read other texts. And that's what I was saying about I think Yasha told about the complexity. And I think it's more a matter of that. I'm against this romantic view that we have. I'm not a phenomenologist, a Husserlian phenomenologist, or a French phenomenologist who thinks I have an intuition. There's no intuition. I don't want any intuitions. I have enough intuitions in my subject. But I think if there is a crisis of reference, and I think there is a crisis of reference that we are going through in a sense, and it's an intuition-free zone. If there is a crisis of reference, there are different references we can mobilize, integrate, develop, etc. So I don't think the philosopher, for example, I don't think he will do science. He may do science as a scientist. He may do politics as a politician. But I don't think, as a philosopher, he will do concepts that make art. Or, he's not, Aristotle already did that with the Poetics, or people took him for doing that. And it worked out in a weird way, we can say. But it's not, I don't think it's something repeatable. But, so in a sense, I would say that, yes, I retain this ambiguity because I do think it's terrible what has become of the Uspian legacy, but I do not think we could have done otherwise. I don't think there was another path. I don't think we could have gone straight to intuitions. On the contrary, I think, of course, this is my, I'm trying to sell my, how do you say, my sardines. I don't know how to translate, but then I'm trying to sell my fish. But I do think the fact that we were so stuck for so long doing these things actually did teach us something, and there was no going around. We could not simply go from I don't know, those racist guys in the 60s who were very weird in Brazil to studying math, science, poetry from a decentered point of view, from a point of view that doesn't center it around philosophy. I think philosophy is, and actually what you said just made me realize, I think in a sense, the Uspian method decentered philosophy from itself. This is only a method. This is the first path of humbling, the first step to humbling. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think we will keep writing as philosophers text about text, and that is not a problem. That is a feature, I think. But it's a matter of discovering how to transform this bug into a feature. And Gabriel, I think, of course, I think there is a poetic structure, but I was thinking of those Renaissance guys who took Aristotle's Poetic as a normative description of poets. of poetry. So it wasn't even Aristotle's fault. But I think that's how I would preserve the ambiguity. There's no access to the reference. And just for one last point regarding this, me and Gabriel, we interviewed Paul Lawrence, and I repeat this every time because I think it's the thing that cleared up everything for me. We were trying to ensnare him because he's very hard to get, and at a certain moment he said, I stopped because, just for people who don't know him, Paul Lawrence started his academic life with a book on time and Hegel. And then he wrote a book on the German ideologists, like what the hell are they doing before Marx? And then he did a book on French, on philosophy professors from São Paulo in the 60s. And then out of the blue, he started writing about like politics and world systems and political movements and etc. So it was a very weird shift.
Yes, the French theory book was around already, right? Like it was written like in the 80s. It's only now that it's published, but the French theory book as well.
Yeah, the French theory book also. Yeah. So he's like, he was a weird Lukács during the 70s and 80s. And then he became like, he only talks now about current politics. But the weird thing is he changes his references from the 90s to the 2000s. He was like a weird not weird, but he was an old school Hegelian Marxist, Adorno, Lukács, and that kind of stuff. And then he starts reading Foucault, Hannah Arendt, people who he despised. He said, I don't like this. This is not my tribe, he says in many instances. And then when he talked about this to us, he said, I started reading what the militant people, the people in the political movements were reading. And that changed his reading in a sense. So he never actually started, now I have a direct reference in politics. Of course he has, but he changed what he reads. He reads now not philosophers, intellectuals in the 1900s. He now reads what these people, activists in movements discuss, and he discusses their references also. So he's reading Agamben, Foucault, etc., because of the people he was following in the political movements. So I think there's an interesting way of dealing with these textual structures from Paul Lawrence himself. I think Gabriel or Yasha.
Yeah, I think it's me.
Gabriel and Renzo were both before me.
Oh yeah.
Well, I was really happy because I think today's presentation made a lot of things a bit clearer for me. I think it was the most systematic. I mean, you had a couple of chances to go through the movements. I think it now it's quite polished. It's much easier for me to follow some of the steps. And also I didn't have an idea of the structure of the work you're planning to write. I think it made some things clearer to me. But I mean, the one thing that I'm really curious to see what you would say. I know that, let's say, there might be a personal predilection, like a personal preference to avoid some, I don't know, you spoke about the cringe aspect of doing philosophy and talking about being and so on. But there is also something very cringy for philosophers, which is talking about, hardcore politics, class analysis, commie stuff. And it's interesting to me that even though your references are hardcore Marxists, it's not like Paul Lawrence slowly became a Marxist recently. He wrote about Hegel because of Marx, right? Yeah. So even though all these guys are Marxists, Badiou and so on, that part of the thing doesn't really play an active role that much. I think that I find it curious that the catchword is institutions, because social worlds are not built only on institutions. My dog is going. She was very vocal about this issue. Social wars are not built only in institutions. You can really track the organization of the world simply by tracking the form of its institutions, right? I feel like the backdrop of the whole argument is very close to that whole Bogdanov discussion about, the way people organize in an era has kind of gives a certain general schema for how they approach thinking in that time. And I find it interesting that in a certain sense, it seems to me that we could approach this distinction between this, you compare constantly to the Platonic kind of universe, to Plato's kind of time and ours. But I think that this might make things a bit muddier because there's at least three distinctions. Like if we're crude about it, we could say like societies where mode A was still quite strong, societies were imperial, they were bureaucratic, they were forming modern institutions, but they're still kind of entangled with the feudal world, seeing the birth of capitalism and so on. And then we have proper late capitalist kind of world. And we could divide them into three, and they kind of map onto the three big periods we have of Greek, German, and current kind of scenario. So when you glue together, mix together these two later periods, like there is a modern and the ancient, I think that some distinctions get lost because some things were effective. I mean, they invented the culture of the written text. They invented the figure of the professor. All these things were invented, long before, but not that long before Kant's time and all of that. There is something which definitely is different from the ancient world. I mean, you can just simply compare the oral versus the written kind of culture. But then it also changes again for us. But we know that the change from, let's say, early modernity to current modernity is subtle in a certain sense because a lot is preserved. So there is a shift, something to be explained, something to be transformed, but at the same time, a lot of stuff will be kept. So it looks like the shift might not be that profound, I mean, disorientation was something Kant was talking about as well. So, there seems to be a continuity. So I think the lack of continuity becomes clear when the economic dimension is a bit more prominent in the discussion, in this kind of social formation discussion and things like this, because we spoke of this already. There are some aspects and features of Plato's world which are definitely worth, if you're going for a materialist reading, they're definitely worth mentioning in terms of explaining why some things might have been the way they were. Right? The size of the world to be explained was very small, right? That's why I think the Bogdanov thing about making this kind of move from natural philosophy to the sort of birth of the kind of modern philosopher, it's a move from kind of oral tradition to written one, also kind of the birth of somebody who's exclusively concerned with philosophy, but at the same time, they share the fact that one person could do all of it. Like, imagine how small the world needs to be for Aristotle to be possible, like to catalog everything. Like the world needs to have like 5 blocks in each direction. So you can actually examine all plants, talk about all forms of theater, rehash everyone's arguments about ontology. Like the world is very small. By the time you get like Descartes, Spinoza, and those guys, the world is a bit bigger. They have news of the rest of the world. This is relevant, right? But at the same time, you can still write like your own treatise for each one of those things. Like you have your physics treatise, your ethical treatise, you have all these things. And then suddenly that's no longer possible, right? So there's something about the mirroring between the size of the world, the economical dimension, the division of labor, and so on, which I think is not really an institutional feature. Like it needs like this bigger picture to be explained. And I think it actually helps with the thing that you were talking with Caron about, because when the description is a bit closer to the institutional, it's also a bit harder to reconcile. Let's say it looks like you're talking about specific people or about specific behaviors. And then of course there are counter arguments. It's just that you want to talk about like these big constraints on the way things are done, right? It seems to be. So this is one aspect. Like I felt like something on, I have the impression that this theory of the division of labor, it's a really good thread to connect the whole thing, because it's larger than institutions. It's the thing institutions are built upon many times, from slavery to kind of sort of rights based by law to the current situation. It might be like we might be able to say a bit more about disorientation than simply like things are very complex. Like, yeah, things are complex because we specialize like crazy, and then we can know a lot about very small things and so on. So I think that would be helpful. And then there's the other aspect, which is not the economic, but I think which I think presents a bit more of a problem. But then I'm cheating because it's things that we talked about elsewhere. Because, well, all these guys who are making these arguments, and I think that the first one to make the argument is Marx himself in German ideology, right? When he's looking at Hegelians on the left in his time, and he's saying, look at these guys. They invented a sort of philosophy that talks about itself, but somehow this empty phraseology has this weird, exciting punch about being like a left radical, but you're just using words in a room. Like, how did that come about? Like, that didn't exist, right? And he has like a double theory for this, like this defensive movement on the one hand, like Germans do this so that they can say they're already spiritually radical, so they don't need to be politically radical. And there's also a sort of critical aspect, like an aspect of crisis, in the sense that, well, even if they did want to talk about something, they wouldn't have something to talk about, right? Which is the thing you're talking about, the reference kind of for Marx changes. I think that there is also an argument there to be made, which I think Jameson makes it the best. Jameson has this very bizarre statement, which is capital is our ontology. Like when you talk about being, you don't get, like you lost the reference, not because there is no reference, but because you're aiming at the metaphysical and you actually hit on the economical. Like the words you're supposed to use, the operation you're supposed to use to get to the metaphysical. Like, let's ask what all things have in common. Well, all things are the product of labor. So you wanted to get a metaphysical answer and you got a historical one. And that kind of got in the way, like it's almost like the philosopher is looking at metaphysical question. When he emits certain statements, that's the referent, and then capital got in the middle, and now that's the referent. But you didn't want it to be, you're meant to be talking about something else. So that's his explanation to why we use political philosophy to talk about, like we use philosophy to talk about politics. He says, for some reason, all these tools we developed to talk about totality, the universe of all things, it's actually the best tools we have to talk about a sort of historical social totality. And I have the impression that this is a more complicated displacement from the reference of philosophy to those of economy than simply saying, Marx showed that philosophers are not talking about anything. It's more like the things you thought you were talking about, they actually exist somewhere else, right? For example, a classic example Marx will give, like one of Marx's classics is to say, oh, so you want to talk about this subject point, which lacks any identity, it has no properties, it doesn't coincide with any predicate. Yeah, the guy on the street who has no properties, no name recognized by the state, it's actually a concrete version of the abstract thing you're passionate about, right? So you thought that was your referent, the abstract idea of subjectivity, but there's actually a concrete reference for it. So I also think that complexifies things a bit, where, and why do I think that's problematic, perhaps? Because I feel like in some level, there is kind of a pure encounter of, one's experience with philosophy as something which displaces us, which you want to preserve from all sorts of social contextualizations where, it might become inauthentic in some level. So, for example, the idea that you are, how to put this, like the idea that taking on this very, very strong political reading of the history of philosophy, right? Social economic changes are like displacing how we refer to things. If you pretend like you don't want to know about the real reference, you're left with an empty phraseology and so on and so forth. Like, if you take that on, what does it make of the kind of, more direct encounter with wonder? Like, what's the place of wonder in a Marxist reading? Because, I mean, the vulgar Marxist kind of explanation is that it's not true wonder, but true suffering that you would get somewhere. It's a bit Christian in a way, right? There's an idea like you see injustice, you feel a wrong, you're the object, like the subject of a wrong, and this is awakening, right? So we trust that where there's oppression, then people will think a way out, something like that. Not wonder, right? There's a very obscene connection to pleasure. I totally agree with you. I don't think you can. I was convinced when I was closer to that what do you call MTST, Workers Without a Home movement, when I went to Curitiba to spend a couple of weeks, and I met this guy who was like this drug dealer in a land occupation, and he was like totally fucked in his life, and he told me that only people who enjoyed being there would stay there. Like, that was his lesson for me. Like, it's not enough to need it. If you don't find any pleasure in it, you're probably not gonna stay in the occupation, which I found amazing. Like, I would never have the guts to say that politics has a pleasurable dimension, but the guy just stated it like, of course, if you don't like doing this shit, you're not gonna do it, which is actually pretty obvious, but it's not anywhere in the Marxist corpus, this thing, right? But I have the impression that the way you describe this, it's very sociologized, it's very materialist in the sense that we're analyzing institutions up to the point where philosophy needs to be needed. And, like you describe this disorientation in social terms, but then the solution comes from philosophical terms, like the Roberto Firmino position, which, I mean, really well-paid Liverpool players, not like humbling position, still like one of the best players in the world. So there's something there which I really wanted you to talk a bit more about, because I feel like you would agree that this economic part makes sense. Like, I've seen you speak about it elsewhere. I think that, the whole Jameson discussion about totality politics also makes sense. But then when it comes to kind of constructing the thread, these things need to be really kind of put to the background, and the discussion kind of becomes more intimate, more manageable to the size of, positions of individuals. Are you the amateur? Are you the professional? Do you have space for wonder, or don't you? Like, is there social space for this? Was this socially substituted, historically substituted for something else? Like, I feel like if you were to pull the thread, perhaps you're concerned that it might undo something that is very precious. Like, there's something there that I'm not clear about, but I have the impression that it's also an important point.
Well, I think, like you said, it's something I didn't talk about, but I agree. I think that's why I take as a starting point the research university program in the 1900s, because I think the problem of the division of labor is present there. So I think when I get to write, I think this is some sort of work that I'll have to do, position better what I do. And so I think I hadn't thought about using Bogdanov, but I think that's a good idea. I'll keep that in mind. And I also think you pointed to some stuff about Jameson that is interesting, because I do have like you said, there's the Paulo Arantes scheme, but I do think Jameson allows that structure to get a bit more nuanced. And I think that could, in a sense, echo to the rest of the book. if I start with that change. But about the position of wonder, this, yes, like you said, you are cheating. But I would have to say that, of course, there are jokes, and then there's the empirical side of me that cannot not appear, especially in presentation settings. But I do think that if I am to truly stay true to the principles that I'm trying to establish, I cannot preserve this place of wonder that is purely philosophical. And that, at least how I'm working it out now, is explained because there is no wonder, pure wonder reference to the world. I think that's why I was a bit unsatisfied with this diagram, because just so I can give some context, most of these diagrams were made when I was offering a course in June or July last year. So there's a 4-part structure because there were 4 classes, and so this was the second class, which will be the second chapter. But this last diagram, it was mostly done out of a desire to try to link up with the end. So that's why I was saying I was not completely satisfied with it. I do agree that the disorientation, the excess, it arrives out of nowhere. And in a sense, I think it does preserve something I would want to be around. I think there needs to be what? No, I think in a sense, the reason for I need to think this through, but I think in a sense, there is a place where I would like to get radically close, but I think it's hard, which is to preserve the idea of, which I said was the radical Uspianism, which is reducing this practice to reading of texts. But I don't think that's completely, because I'm not for killing philosophy, not because of that, but because in a sense I think the place of wonder or of excess is not something that this is not a direct experience of wonder as Plato or Aristotle described. It's not, oh, I'm here in the world and what is this? Is this a monkey? Is this a cat? There are no monkeys.
It is a monkey, the wonder of
Oh, this is something interesting. This is something someone told me once. There were no animals who stood on 2 feet in Greece. So that's maybe why there were no mammals, like there were no monkeys near Athens. So the biped without feathers might have something to do with that.
Can I just ask 2 things, like just to
yeah,
follow up on what you said? One thing is, I really think this question is very profound. Like, perhaps that's the more, I mean, in my opinion, that would be the materialist thread of the whole thing. Like, there is something Plato calls wonderment. There might be social conditions for one to experience this. Social conditions have changed. Where the fuck has that gone? And
yes,
right, just that question. I think the whole thing about disorientation, like the kind of decrepitude of philosophical system, I think it follows from that question. Like, I think that really is the most profound question. And I think that's the question, when I read your doctoral thesis, that's the thing I think is behind the whole Spinoza thing, because once you lose wonderment in the world, you can still feel it when you read Spinoza. Like, he produces that feeling, like definitely it's like the most elegant thing ever written. So there is something to that. Like, for me, you describe more like a love affair than the philosophical practice when you're talking about that particular point. But my second question is, so that's one point. And the second is, I think it would be worth comparing, because you're saying some things which I'm not sure are exclusive of philosophy. Like you could talk about, let's say, the decrepitude of, music school today in the universities, or, the school of political science. Like, what the fuck, Like they all go through something which becomes kind of circular, academicist, rehashing of old forms, studying the past. Like, it's not exactly exclusive of philosophy, but perhaps it looks like a non-question because they have the benefit of having an answer to the question, what's the point of all this, right? So, like, it's easier to answer that question, even though if you look at what's really happening, it's still not going anywhere and still kind of running in false, like with the exception perhaps of, which I think it's not really the case. Like, it's not like graduate students in most scientific courses are doing like productive work there. Mathematics course in Brazil, if you finish high school having reached 2,000 years ago of mathematical knowledge, you finish your undergraduate courses around the 1800s. You need to do like a master's and perhaps a PhD to reach the 20th century, like have a course in relativity theory. So even in the sciences, in a certain sense, that's also the case, but there are specificities because of how research is connected to the university and private sector and so on. But some of the stuff you said actually applies to a larger category, so it's not that singular. Though I agree that there's still something singular there, but perhaps making those comparisons also helps to clarify what it is, And it goes back to this question, like social conditions of a certain experience. I mean, following, for example, stuff that Caron does, and that kind of the noise community in Rio and things like that, you can see that there is this experience of, it's almost like a slap in the face. You won't get it like in a certain mainstream. It is kind of avant-garde, but you won't get it in the classes about avant-garde music, right? So there is a discussion about these social conditions, which I think apply more generally, like in Badiouian terms, to what are the material conditions for somebody to experience something like incorporation, or participation, or something like that. And then the restricted question of, okay, but what are the further conditions for this to lead into something like a philosophical wonderment, right? Something like that, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good point. I'll have to think through it, because I do think that in a sense, the problem is the fact that the conditions of wonder were affected by this the specialization of work and so on. I do think there's a thread there that could help, but I still have to think some thoughts, because because there's this specific problem, which is a material one, which is, I need to get this out. I need to poop. Like, I've got it's not good. I need to get it out. So I have to decide how to do this movement without getting more burdened by it. So there's this thing I have to see how to connect. But I do think that in a sense, the differentiating from other practices is something that I need to work through. And I could maybe try and sketch it in a way, but I'll have to think. I think it's Renzo now.
Yeah, I guess like I really like the presentation, and like my comments, it touches I think a bit on the first part of Gabriel's comments. So it's not it's on this question about like the social conditions that sort of like structure, yeah, the social, the periodization of this, of the social like structures that conditions these changes in philosophy, and not too much like the what's exceptional philosophy, which sort of like makes it resist the sort of like socialization of philosophy. But yeah, like because this change you describe from like the academic to the non-academic sort of like paradigm, it sort of like remind me of, I think it was a text, I think you shared it some from Laden Dolar, which has one of the greatest titles I think of, which is The Master and the Professor Are Dead, I'm Not Feeling Well Myself. And I think there's like a really cool periodization that seems to sort of track like your stages, which because he starts the text with this passage from the master to the professor, right, which would be like from feudalism to the sort of like post revolutionary, in which like Hegel would be like the first guy that would make this change. And it also reminds me of stuff from Rancière, which they sort of like describe the way that the university sort of equates knowledge and power, like it has like this way of the philosopher, like the professor, being this guardian of knowledge, so he has some power. But they also like frame that, I think is a really like cool idea, in which he says at some point like the university is the best way to neutralize a revolution, which so it has like this function of sort of like neutralizing and incorporating the tensions of that were at stake at the French Revolution into a sort of like institutional space. And so he also says, I was looking at it again, like he says that the word becomes a part of the university, not the other way around. So there's this sort of like internalization of like struggling into the universe. And also it's funny because it feels like I remember that Vladimir Saflati, he always tells this anecdote that he heard from, I don't know, that people, I don't know like who told him or if he says that, but in May 68, like the most effective way that like the state ended May 68 was like founding a university and then putting all like the intellectuals, the radical intellectuals, and giving them a chair, like a lifelong chair, so they could discuss and like fight inside the university. That's how it ended. So it's there's like it begins and ends with this sort of like neutralization. And yeah, and then I was thinking of this new sort of paradigm, which like sort of like keratinizing, you would go from state to capital, and before it was something like communitarian, which I think Paul Arendts also describes a lot in that academic capitalist article, which I think is, so it seems to be this sort of new function that university starts to like have, not anymore of like this sort of more like state function of sort of like a relation to power, but more like about having this sort of like economic role in like economic development and scientific research, and so all this like paradigm of democratizing the university, and it also like tracks it sort of becoming a commodity. So it seems to me that this is the process that sort of like is conditioning this sort of new role of, which it's not clear to me how it impacts philosophy, but I mean, there seems to be, that's, I mean, I think one of the, what I was wondering about it. And then I was thinking like this process, which we're now like sort of experiencing from maybe since 68, in which like you sort of like democratize the university, at the same time it becomes sort of this product that it's relevant for economic development. like I was thinking like the specific context of Brazil, which it's sort of interesting how like that's something like I think about like we had like this sort of arch of democratization and this big horizon of university as this, you know, like public education being like the biggest horizon of the left in terms of, you know, like what the state could do. And we in part partially had it, like so many universities were built, and then there's, I think what's one of the main, like most important like things is that's the affirmative, the quota, legi quotas, the affirmative action, which sort of like changes. So it seems that, yeah, and then this is more like the second part of my like comment that I would like to, which is how do you view this sort of like conjuncture within this broader periodization? And because I feel like this sort of like horizon sort of like got realized in Brazil sort of like too late, like at the same time that you got people entering for the first time university and it really like changing what it is. It's not anymore like that place of knowledge is just like something else. It's already like, it's also the end of this, it seems to me like this horizon of some like public, you know, like more Humboldtian like mission of university that could so I mean and it wasn't even like Bolsonaro, like okay, Bolsonaro did like the last, but I mean it was during very like workers government. You already had it, like you, I mean I like the university I did my master's, it was like inaugurated and my master like supervisor got in, so it was like this super big campus in São José's campus, and at the same time it felt already like underfunded and like in crisis and without money, so it sort of like was already broken down as it was sort of like built. So yeah, that's one thing like I wonder a lot, like whether there is still like stuff to be realized within the university because like its composition change, or whether like this sort of like para-academic is actually the low in like private universities and autonomous groups is sort of like the real locus of where stuff like philosophical activity and but also like all sorts of like thinking will head. Like I think there's like this weird, I don't know, like hard dead end that we have in Brazil. That's, I don't know. But yeah, I was just thinking that in the first part, like how this sort of like periodization of the role of universities and social formations could maybe like, it would be interesting to see it connected in this more like more abstract paradigms of philosophy, and whether it sort of tracks that a bit, this change towards disorientation. Yeah, sorry for it was a long.
No, it was great. I think there's one thing that I need to make it clear, I think, is that I think there's a continuity. The period I'm trying to describe is the life and death of the research university, which is the project that Dolar describes, and I think that was the text that was very much on my mind, not on the specific details, but he does give a great rundown of the beginnings of the research university program in that text, aside from the Lacanian stuff in the end. And I do think there is a thread that is not, there's no, I'm very, I don't have much, how do you say, saco? I don't have much, I don't care much for the hyper periodization that changes like the neoliberalism moment of the university, that I don't know, it's too much on the at least on the Brazilian public sphere, it's too much for me. So I do think there's a continuity between the research university that was created in the beginning of the 19th century. And I think there's a specificity of philosophy, and that's why I plan to focus on Kant a bit. It may be anecdotal, but Kant was a working philosopher in a sense. He depended upon his wages. And I don't think I could connect this thread completely to show that his philosophy, because that would be a work on Kant. But I do think that there's a hint that the fact that he was a professor in that time where things were starting to organize themselves in a way that the modern university would develop, I think there's a thread there. So in a sense, I do need to straighten out the social background, and I think the references you pointed out were pretty interesting. That connects this period. Now, this leads me to the other point you were saying, which I think is very interesting, because in a sense, I'm not. I think it's the problem we have is that the university is dead and alive at the same time, or better, it's dead, but it's not buried, and it won't be buried for so long. I joke around that I think the university is one of the greatest basic income experiments in the world, in the sense, not that it, of course, it doesn't provide basic income to anybody, but we can see in Brazil how it allows people to temporarily shift the focus on their lives, even if what we've been witnessing hasn't been good. It's an example of how we can redistribute and allow people to participate in democracy in a different form, and also in a sense that even if, like, for a glimpse, and I don't think it's a glimpse that lasted one moment in time, but I think it's something that persists, that is present. It allows people not to subordinate their desires to the need to work. I think there's I'm not expressing myself fully, but I think there's a manner in how there's an inversion of priorities that the university allowed us to develop. But I think one of the problems is I think now that I'm thinking about it, and the same thing that allows the university to be this place, maybe something that displaces philosophy as a place of wonder, but it's something now that I'm thinking I'd have to think through. But I've been thinking, since this is a dead body, but it's not going to be buried, I think what interests me is tactics and strategies to use this body. I've been interested in the Black radical tradition. Fred Moten, his undercomments with, I've read it recently, the undercomments written with the other guy. I don't remember the other guy's name, but and I think there's this this attempt to use the university for other means, and it's not something that's pre-given. It's something that in a sense takes the university as something, it doesn't even matter if the university is dead, and maybe that's the point. But so in a sense, I think because affirmative actions in the US have a longer history than in Brazil, especially in terms of participation in the university, I think there may be some material to understand how this works. Of course, there are many differences, but this is very unfortunate. Like you pointed out, we only have 10 years of this. It's not so long, and it's not looking really good. So, but I definitely don't think the root is something that would be completely para-academic, because I don't think financially, materially, the conditions that the university provided can be replicated. I think that's like fool's gold. I think this belief that we're seeing this like in Brazil, this is happening with many philosophy students. They're creating their parallel institutes, like I myself am or was involved in this. And I think if you're believing that this can get a life of its own, I think it's very unwise. And I think you're not understanding why you as a singular person might be getting by. Because of course,
Can I add something here?
yeah,
Like this was part of the last meeting conversation. I would agree. I would disagree a little bit. Like it can be independent from the university, but on the condition to be dependent on the artwork. So
yes, I think that was very good.
You know,
Yeah.
For para-academia to function independently of the university, it has to be a parasitic upon another thing. And I think the best candidate other than university is the artwork.
Yes.
So yeah, there you get, like you have to, either you are linked to a university or you're linked to the artwork.
Yeah.
And the experiences that Gabriel was mentioning, like people going to a noise concert and getting slapped in their face because it's not an academic, even if they study, you know, avant-garde music in the academia, it's not academic, an academic discipline there. I had the same. I had the kind of the same. I see kind of the same reaction to para-academia. Like people really like to go outside of the university environment into so-called the wild or something like that, and see, for instance, presentation at FOSO, our space there, or at the new center and all of that. This is very attractive to people because it's not directly linked to the world of labor, I think. The problem is that university is there not, I think it's somewhat like a cabide de emprego in a certain sense, like it's something that, you know, gives people a job. So you have to learn the tools of the trade, and the tools of the trade for, you know, of being a philosopher is learning like how to, I don't know, write a sound argument in first order logic, or maybe some other form of logic, or maybe referring classic. Like people go there for a different set of reasons. They go there because they like it. They go there because, you know, of the reasons they find in the noise concert or in the noise presentation or in the, you know, lecture in the underground basement on, you know, whatever. Those are the real reasons that get them into the university, but they stay because they have to learn the tools of the trade and earn money. So there's a different thing. This is why I was talking about a different, like a different set of functions. Like it's not like two different groups of people. Like those who are like the university zombies that are only there. Yeah, write another paper and you have to publish on synthesis, and this is your life now. Of course, there are some people that asymptotically this is why I was telling you, like there is a difference of functions in the same person. Like you university for a reason, but you stay there for another reason, and you stay because you have to, you know, navigate, which is one of your themes. Navigate this world, like trying to earn money and doing something you love at the same time, which is tricky and difficult. So this is kind of the problem, and you kind of recuperate that passion when you are the irony and all that. But at the same time, you have to be either in a university or you have to be the best candidates for maintaining a para-academic institution is I don't really see another way. I mean, maybe I'm blind to another alternative, but these are the two positions I see currently for a para-academic institution.
My internet just like went down for a bit, so I didn't catch the last part. But as you were saying, how I guess I agree with you, and I think that was a very good point you made on the. I saw it later, because I do think there is no money for para-academic institutions, and I actually think we could also point out, though it's done, I wouldn't say not only parasitically, but it's a bit farcical. But we could also say the political circuit linked parties and institutes connected to parties could also be one way. It's very early, but we can see that there is a circuit in Brazil, at least, being established between Boitempo, Jacobin. It won't be long before there are courses and stuff that are linked to that. So, and not really judging, even if they want to hire me, I'm over here. But I do think that there's this misapprehension if you don't realize that there is a parasitic element. Yeah, there are the MST schools. I don't know much about them either, but I think they are very internal in a sense. They don't seem to be they don't seem to be for the general public, which I think might be the difference. But I do think, in a sense, that's something that is worth talking about. I'll have to think a lot after today.
Yeah.
That's
I would also.
Yeah.
No, I'll just a small comment. Yeah, I would just say that I think the private sector of education in Brazil, I think, also has to be like put into the equation. Like there's also both the university and both like the high schools. There's this really big expansion of conglomerate, like education conglomerates in Brazil. Like it's impressive, and it was built on top of like all the like FIES and all this I don't know how to call it, like private scholarships. It's sort of like inflated the
funding for private sector.
Yeah, it inflated the sector in like a whole new level, which I think there's also space for what can be done there, I think. And like, if you can also like, and you said you don't agree with this periodization, which is sort of like a break at the end of the 20th century. I was curious to know like why, because I mean, I also think that like neoliberalism becomes like this general, like this, yeah, but I don't know. I was curious because I do feel that the economic role of universities really changed. Like, I don't know, like Piketty says how like education is like the main factor that sort of like controls inequality, and so it really, to me, seems to have a new like economic role that it didn't have before, which is tied to democratization. And so I was just curious because you said you sort of see a real continuity, right?
Yeah, just to answer something, because I think John mentioned something that's important about the right wing. In Brazil, we have this very famous online philosophy course by Olavo de Carvalho, and there's this media company called Parallel Brazil, which would be the closest, I think, to this. But it's still parasitic, because if you see, at least it's Olavo de Carvalho did probably the biggest online philosophy course, I don't know, maybe in the world, like, which is truly private, like one citizen. It was really big, but it was mostly dependent on a class of bureaucratic, I don't know, state laborers generally lawyers, judges, people in the administration that entered into the state employment, because in Brazil it's very, there's like, you do a test to be a judge at stuff, and it's like very, you have to memorize stuff. So it's like it produces a very, in a sense, I think the exam produces the person who will then feel some emptiness, and then it collapses into this right-wing space. But I think that's a good point to think. But regarding your question, Renzo, I think my point is it's very crude, maybe rough, and it's just that I think, well, the conditions of labor seem to remain the same in a sense, not in the sense that it's the same world, but in a sense that I think the fact that, oh, thanks, Carol. I want to talk to you afterwards. I think the fact that we're having platform economy and stuff and those kinds of workers. You were also in Raquel's course, I think, right? I think that there's a continuity in the story that she told, in the sense that what is appearing is like the unemployed is like the essence of this moment we have been living, and so I think there's a continuity in the sense that the worker, the type of work, selling your labor for wage, I think in a sense it hasn't changed enough, so we can do these differentiations and prioritizations. I would say that this is actually more radicalizing than a novelty. Of course, as something that's more radical, there's a break. But I don't know. Sometimes I think that I'm very I'm too resentful with my past, because there's somebody forced me to talk about neoliberalism in my dissertation in a way that was totally uncalled for. So now I have this birre, this grudge, and I may be deaf to these differentiations. But at least in the sense, I think if you say the university project at the beginning, the 19th century, there are two, I think, projects that are at the moment that exist. It's the research university program in Germany, which is the idea that you have to have a place, which in a sense, science starts mimicking the labor division. And I think the university, the departments, it develops into that direction. But you can also get the French side of things, where it's like there's a public education of the population, where the population is being taught, because that's the problem with the French Revolution. You need to teach the people to be Democrats after all the mess they made. So it makes sense that if our world is a world where the division of labor is ever increasing, where the subject is oriented to the work, etc., that the university would go in this direction, that these plans for knowledge, wisdom would rapidly fall to the sides and be marginalized. And this is funny because, I mean, the French are hilarious because they are people with ideas. I mean, I hate the French. I hate French philosophers. But what makes me closer to them than American or English philosophy is because at least they have ideas. And it's very cringe, the idea of making a administrative class. I mean, they are really Platonists. The École Normale is a school, a an undergrad school, to form people with the pillars of Western civilization and the most advanced sciences in whatever point you decide to focus on. But it's dedicated to constructing a Gordian class, to take a Platonic theme, a Gordian class that will preserve the Republic. And the fact that that's clearly passé, it's like, it makes sense because the Gordian structure is like something from ancient philosophy or maybe other social formations. It doesn't make sense to have a political class that is wise, I think. And so in a sense, I think there's a contradiction. There's a dying world that gets inside, maybe, I don't know, I'm just speculating. Maybe there's a dying world that gets inside the university, but it was already dying, the wisdom part. I don't know, I'm just, maybe I'm tired, so I don't know if I'm making sense anymore, I'm sorry.
Can I add just a comment?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm not.
Just from
I cannot make sense. I can continue not making sense. I don't have to.
Yeah, sure. The first comment I just wanted to bring up, I thought of this when Gabriel mentioned earlier, I guess like maybe the similar crisis in mathematics that kind of exists right now, where there's been, I guess, like an over specialization over the past, like, let's say 70, 100 years, where even the most, like the top of their fields, mathematicians who like study everything cannot possibly understand like the entire corpus of mathematics today, right? Which was possible like 70, 80 years ago or so. But today there's just too much, you know? But that got me thinking that it seems like the way that, and this is when you were talking about the ways that subjects justify themselves, right? So how like a lot of the, I guess like STEM, engineering, science subjects generally justify themselves in terms of like technology, profit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But pure math has this weird, applied math is different. That's like specifically for application, but pure math is this weird place where it justifies itself in terms of this like promised, but also knowingly very uncertain future, right? So there's always like this talk about how the mathematics of general relativity was developed by Riemann, right? And then like about 100 years later, Einstein used it. Or like cryptography, right? It's like origins in 1800s number theory, and now it's like the foundation of our banking system, for example. So it always justifies itself in this like future way where it looks back and it says, we developed these tools, they were useful, so the things we're developing now, which we have no idea what they even mean, might be useful like in the future. But the interesting thing is that within the study itself, there's this like huge self-awareness that the things that people study today in pure mathematics, it's like the extent to which like when it will like society will even be able to comprehend the ideas and then use them is like is getting farther and farther. So like the math of like whatever homotopy type theory, which is like some crazy things that people are developing now that like 5 people half understand kind of thing. If it's ever like applied in the real world, it's gonna be in like 300-400 years, you know, kind of thing. So I think that is like a big crisis in mathematics right now, that like unless there's some big change that you can understand everything from a new perspective and like not have to build from this ground up, like I don't really know. But I feel like it feels similar to the crisis in philosophy. It's different in structure, but it has a similar form. So I just wanted to add that comment just to have it out there. But the question I had was just about going way back to, this is the second the diagram you had that was called the structure of problems in Platonic philosophical activity, just to try to connect it to the Atlas. In those three kind of self loop processes that you have in concept, doxa, and practice, does that not correspond to the composition, intelligibility, interaction triad almost, right? Composability is already there in the concept. So yeah. Equivocation to me feels like, maybe you have to clarify this, the process of like developing intelligibility, right? It's like implying that we might not understand each other quite yet, but we're throwing shit at the wall and we're like trying to figure out what sticks. Yeah. And then pluralization to me feels like interaction is almost like the process of pluralizing, because you have these different contextualized methods or worlds. And then I don't know if you were developing this before or how much you feel like that works with it. I don't know.
No, I think it's great because I think you just made my life a lot easier, because I was
okay, good.
no, because I do think it's I think that's and it links up to the math stuff you were saying. Mm-hmm. It was very interesting because this was a presentation that I did, and Renzo was actually there, I think, but it was late. But it was even later in Portuguese. And at the end, there was one person who was a mathematician, and he was like, "This seems so similar, but it's different."
Yeah.
And I think you spelled out very, 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 very clearly the differences. And I think it's weird because I hate when things fit too much, but it seems that philosophy, math is future oriented and philosophy is past oriented. I think there's a temporal disjunction that maybe, because it's very funny because you're like, this fits very well with this. And then I was like, yes, this is, these are the moments where I was like, okay, this makes sense. And like, yes, it was worth it, 2,500 years of philosophy. But it's very weird because it's not, I think in philosophy, we are always saying, wow, this makes sense. When we look at the past, it makes sense. But when we look at and math seems to be the opposite. And I was actually thinking I was reading Karatani's book on Marx, and he does that Karatani stuff, like he says 2 sentences and you're like, wow, your sentences are more dense than every philosopher I know. And he was like, well, and it's very simple always, like we only care about Marx's early work because of his late work. And it's like very stupid and banal and trivial, and it's true. But and I think in a sense, the problem with philosophy, and this is a very long discussion, but I think it links, is it seems to be a repository of formal experimentation like mathematics. But I think I'd like to understand the differences from this future and past point of view, because I think it might be a better way maybe to understand math, the role of politics. Yeah, like it does in what sense, Renzo? It does the future.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of like 20th century politics was all about like revolution and this big like the possibility of talking about the future with an horizon and like an intelligible like coming to be, and this is sort of like historically over, like we're the planet may end, we have no like left, and I just realized like with Yasha that math seems to still be able to do that. Like you don't know like what it's going to be used for, but it's still like addressed to the future, and it sort of ties, I think, with our project a bit, right? Which does a bit of both.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, because if math is future oriented, it makes a lot of sense to put your what you're going to invest on, like in math. But so I think in a sense, the role for philosophy would be maybe I don't know, this. I think this what you guys said is great, because if math is like how we look at the future in politics, because it still has that revolutionary impetus, the relationship to philosophy doesn't have to be a look at the future. If we look for the future in philosophy, we're fucked. But it's the way of dealing with the past, in a sense. Like, what is the past in what is the role of the past in the political struggle? So if math is the future in the, I don't know, scientific knowledge struggle, philosophy deals with the past. And in politics, you have to deal with both, because there are a lot of ghosts also in philosophy. It seems like we're like, we have to detect the helpful ghosts from the wrong ghosts. I don't know, maybe it's something along those lines. I don't know.
Maybe it does seem very similar to Badiou's approach to how math and philosophy are kind of related, where they have a sort of duality to them, where they each sit at this unique position, but also, yeah, I don't know, maybe this is a clarification of that potentially.
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't have anything more specific about that, but
oh yeah. But well, guys, I'd like to thank you all, because this was great. I think you guys added a couple of months to my book or more, but I think it's great. Okay.
Nice.
It's really nice.
Okay.
All right.
See y'all.
Thanks for the discussion. We'll
Thank
see
you very
y'all.
much.
We're here. Excited to hear this develop. Bye.
Bye.